Okay, let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive today into a set of sources you shared, focusing on the UK's foreign aid budget, and specifically how a pretty significant chunk of it is, well, being used right here at home.
That's right.
The mission really is to get our heads around the financial side, the policy challenges, and, the wider implications of using aid money for things like housing asylum seekers in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Get ready, because some of the figures in these materials are quite striking. It paints a complex picture.
Yeah, and what's really interesting looking across these sources is how official development assistance, that's ODA, the money meant for, tackling poverty overseas, seems to be increasingly diverted towards this really pressing domestic issue. Now, international rules do allow some ODA use for asylum seekers in their first year here.
Right, there are provisions.
There are. But the scale described in the sources, this continuous substantial spending, it sort of suggests this has gone way beyond a temporary thing.
It sounds like it's become almost structural.
Yeah, almost like a structural reliance, you could say.
Yeah. And the numbers you mentioned, they really drive that home. One figure that jumped out at me immediately was the Home Office projection. They're expecting to spend £2.2 billion of ODA this financial year just on hotels for asylum seekers.
Just on hotels, yeah. And the sources point out that's only slightly down from last year's $2.3 billion.
For housing around, 32,000 people in hotels across the country?
Exactly. And then if you connect that to the bigger picture, especially what the National Audit Office found, and remember the NAO is the independent spending watchdog, so their reports, they carry weight.
Definitely.
They uncovered this pretty staggering cost increase. Contracts signed back in 2019, they were initially thinking $4.5 billion for asylum accommodation over 10 years.
Okay.
Well, the NAO now projects that figure is likely to be $15.3 billion.
Whoa, wait. $15.3 billion,
Yeah.
up from an initial $4.5 billion.
That's what the sources indicate, yeah.
That's nearly a 340% increase mentioned there. Seeing that kind of cost jump becomes even more significant when you look at the UK's total ODA budget context provided in your materials.
Absolutely, because with the overall aid budget itself potentially shrinking, there's talk, like Labour's proposal mentioned, of potentially reducing it from 0.5% of GNI, maybe down towards more 0.3% by 2027.
Which would mean going from about $14 billion down to maybe £9 billion?
Something like that. So in that tighter funding situation, these multi-billion-pound domestic asylum costs suddenly take up a much, much bigger slice of the pie.
Which raises a key question the sources touch on, doesn't it? How are policies actually trying to tackle this reliance on hotels and these rising costs? The Home Office, according to the materials, says it's committed to ending hotel use, speeding up decisions. What are they actually doing?
Well, the sources mention things like trying to reduce appeal times, implementing stricter financial checks on asylum seekers, and, crucially, working on increasing dispersal accommodation.
Dispersal accommodation.
Yeah.
So that's basically moving people out of expensive hotels into, cheaper, more sustainable housing elsewhere.
That's the idea, yeah. More sustainable, less costly places around the country.
But your sources seem to highlight a real bottleneck there. That dispersal accommodation just hasn't kept up with the number of applications coming in.
That seems to be the crux of it. There's a record number of applications, and the capacity to move people out of hotels just isn't there yet.
So even with policies aiming for a transition, the system can't quite deliver.
That disconnect appears to be a major hurdle, yeah. It seems to limit how effective those policies can be, which helps explain why the ODA spending on hotels only saw that small dip we mentioned, despite the goals. And of course, the politics around this, as seen in the sources, is very visible, with different parties debating the hotel use and the aid diversion.
And looking at the impact of diverting this aid, your sources bring up something interesting from Whitehall officials and charities. They point out the Home Office might not have a strong internal incentive to cut this specific spending because it comes from the ODA budget, not their main departmental funds. Is that right?
That's a dynamic highlighted in the sources, yes. It creates this situation where money intended for global priorities, the whole point of ODA, gets used here at home. There are quotes in the materials, like Gideon Rabinowitz from Bond, saying, diverting £2.2 billion like this is unsustainable, poor value for money, and it happens, quote, at the expense of vital development and humanitarian programs tackling the root causes.
Yeah, the phrase robbing Peter to pay Paul seems to come up quite a bit in the materials, using money meant to tackle root causes overseas to pay for the symptoms here.
And Sarah Champion, who chairs the International Development Committee, she reinforces that in your sources. She calls it savage cuts and Home Office raids on the aid budget. She argues it puts the UK's development work and reputation at risk, stressing that aid is meant for the world's poorest.
Right.
Using it on expensive hotels here, in her view, makes that core job harder and is, as she puts it, a perverse use of taxpayer money.
So when we put all these pieces from your sources together, what does it all mean? I mean, this deep dive really shows a clear and growing tension, doesn't it? A tension between meeting these immediate domestic needs around asylum and, well, fulfilling those long-standing international promises that foreign aid is for.
Exactly.
The numbers are pretty stark. That NAO projection, $15.3 billion versus the initial $4.5 billion, and the fact that we're still spending billions each year on hotels, it shows that money, originally intended for global poverty and development, is being heavily diverted.
And it really raises an important question, I think. If spending this aid money here at home on what are essentially reactive solutions like temporary housing, if that prevents investment in tackling the root causes of why people are displaced in the first place, things like instability, poverty, conflict abroad, are we perhaps caught in a kind of cycle? A cycle that in the long run just makes the problem harder, maybe more costly, and more persistent.
That's definitely something the materials leave you to mull over.